For centuries, the common wisdom was that economies before the Industrial Revolution were, well, more or less stuck in a rut, right?
Hmm.
Not much growth. Things stayed pretty similar. But the deeper you dig into the history, especially in Europe, you start to see a very different picture. Periods of real economic energy and change long before factories and steam engines took over.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's this idea, this European miracle, how Europe managed to shift from being, on par with or even behind Asia to eventually taking the economic lead that we're diving into today.
Yeah.
You're looking to understand the roots of this shift, and that's exactly what we aim to unpack.
Indeed. And we have a rich set of materials to explore, from Professor Elliott's insightful lecture laying out these very foundations to GDP per capita graphs that visually demonstrate economic booms and busts.
Those are really helpful visuals.
They are. And historical maps, too, that illustrate the changing patterns of global trade. Our mission really is to journey through the years 1300 to 1800, identifying the crucial phases and the key forces that propelled economic change in various regions of Europe.
So think of it as a focused exploration. We'll begin in the vibrant Mediterranean, examining the early economic sparks ignited by the Italian city-states.
Uh-huh.
Then we'll set sail with Portugal and their transformative great discoveries. Finally, we'll head north to witness the ascent of northwestern Europe with a close look at the Dutch Golden Age and how Britain ultimately forged the path to modern economic growth. Okay, let's get started with phase one, the Mediterranean, roughly from 1300 to 1500.
What's particularly insightful here is Professor Broadberry's work, which really challenges that long-held view of, stagnant pre-industrial economies.
Right.
If you glance at the GDP per capita graph, even during this early period marked as phase one, you can observe distinct ups and downs, especially in Italy.
Yeah, you really can see the fluctuations.
Exactly. And these fluctuations aren't characteristic of a static economy. They signal societies actively adapting, embracing new technologies, institutions, and ways of doing things.
Exactly. And the Italian city-states, places like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were the real economic engines in these early centuries.
Definitely.
Following the fall of the Roman Empire, Venice largely spearheaded the reopening of European trade networks. Then, Genoa's significant naval victory in 1291, which opened up the Straits of Gibraltar, that was another pivotal moment, right? Unlocking new possibilities for trade routes.
Precisely. And this increase in shipping and commerce spurred a whole host of supporting industries. Consider shipbuilding, the timber trade necessary for it, carpentry, even rope making.
All interconnected?
Yes. And they weren't just importing goods, they were also actively developing their own domestic production of items like glass, silk, sugar, and even books, a process we call import substitution.
Ah, okay.
Crucially, they had surprisingly high levels of food production, which freed up people to specialize in these other emerging industries.
And naturally, where you have thriving trade, you need sophisticated ways to handle money. This period saw the rise of advanced financial tools.
Finance really took off.
Gold coins like the florin from Florence and the ducat from Venice became the standard currencies for international trade. Banking also evolved from simple money exchange to include deposit banks as early as the 12th century.
Which is quite early when you think about it.
It really is. Along with the development of things like overdrafts, basically borrowing money from the bank, and marine insurance, which was vital for protecting those risky overseas trading voyages. Take a look at this image of a gold florin. It's a tangible reminder of this financial innovation.
What's remarkable is the combination of factors that allowed these city-states to prosper. It wasn't just chance.
Right, it wasn't just luck.
No, there was significant involvement from the state, direct participation in shipbuilding, leasing out public ships to ensure safer travel, and even organizing trade convoys.
So active government support.
Yes, but beyond that, they cultivated what we now recognize as good institutions. New forms of business organization emerged, allowing people to pool resources and share risks in ways previous structures didn't.
Like partnerships and such.
Exactly. They established a regulated market for government bonds. And for the time, they were relatively tolerant states with forms of democratic governance. Improvements in agricultural techniques and legal systems that clearly defined and protected property rights and contracts also played a vital role.
Ah, property rights, always key.
Always. Think of these good institutions as the foundational rules that made economic activity more predictable and trustworthy.
It's almost as if they were laying the groundwork, building those initial fundamental elements that later, more complex economies would build upon. These advancements in trade, finance, and even how they were governed really set the stage for what came next.
That's a great way to put it.
But as we know, history is a story of change. Our next phase is what Professor Elliott terms the first critical juncture, the Black Death and the opening of new trade routes.
Yes, exactly. Brybeary emphasizes these as key turning points, where different economies reacted in significantly different ways. The Black Death, a truly devastating event,
Unimaginable, really.
and the new trade routes, which presented both new opportunities and new challenges. Initially, Italy really capitalized on its existing Mediterranean trade, particularly after the Black Death caused widespread disruption elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to consider Grief's research comparing Maghribi and Genoese traders. The collectivist Maghribi system relied on strong internal community ties for trust,
Right, based on reputation within the group.
whereas the more individualistic Genoese system, while requiring more formal agreements and legal structures, was actually an early step towards those European institutions we were just discussing, anonymous exchange and relying on third parties to enforce contracts, rather than just personal relationships.
That's a really interesting distinction, and it's such an interesting contrast with what was happening in China around the same time.
Yes, the comparison is stark.
They had incredibly advanced shipping in the 15th century's Zhang. These voyages were massive. Their ships were far larger than European ones, as you can see in this comparison image.
Truly enormous shifts.
They had well-integrated internal markets, but then a shift in government priorities, internal conflicts, led to a kind of turn inwards.
A real change in direction.
The large fleet was dismantled, and there was a less favorable view of merchants. It really feels like a huge opportunity that was missed, and one that Europe then really took advantage of.
Absolutely. Which brings us nicely to Phase 2, the rise of northwestern Europe, spanning from roughly 1500 to 1700.
Okay, shifting north.
If you look at the GDP per capita graph again, you'll see Holland really starting its climb during this period. And the initial spark for this phase often goes to Portugal and their great discoveries.
Portugal really became a leader in shipbuilding during the 15th century, didn't they? Even surpassing Italy for a time?
They did. And then those incredible voyages sailing around the Cape of Good Hope to India, reaching Canton in Japan, were truly transformative. They established this vast network of trading ports and colonies, as you can see on this 16th century trade map.
A global reach, really.
But it's vital to also acknowledge the darker side of this expansion, the sheer scale of the Portuguese involvement in the slave trade,
A crucial point, yes.
and their intensive sugar production in places like Madeira and Brazil had immense and devastating human consequences.
Looking at why they were so successful initially, there was definitely strong support from the state, particularly under Prince Henry the Navigator and his School of Sagres, which fostered advancements in navigation and map-making.
Right, state sponsorship played a big role.
They also had some geographical advantages, being located on the Atlantic, and maybe a bit of luck with the weakening of Venice and the Treaty of Tordesillas, which granted them a significant portion of the New World in Brazil. Here's an image of Prince Henry, a key figure in this era.
However, as Professor Elliott's lecture notes point out, Portugal's success wasn't built on a strong foundation of what we've called good institutions.
Ah, okay, that's the catch.
That's the catch. The Crown maintained very tight control, which ultimately limited the initiative of merchants and prevented long-term sustained growth. This created an opening for the next major player, the Dutch.
Ah, the Dutch Golden Age. Starting around the 17th century, they truly came into their own. Amsterdam became this central hub for trade in northwestern Europe.
The main entrepot. Yeah.
Their merchant fleet was the largest in Europe by the 16th century, and they essentially took over from Portugal as the dominant European traders in Asia, as this image of the returning Dutch East India fleet in 1599 illustrates. This 17th century trade map really highlights the vast reach of their trade networks.
Their agriculture was remarkably productive too, even if their manufacturing sector lagged slightly behind. But where the Dutch truly excelled was in finance.
More financial innovation.
Definitely. They developed sophisticated instruments like bills of exchange, essentially IOUs used for large transactions, and the Amsterdam Exchange became the world's first modern stock market. A truly groundbreaking innovation, as you can see in this image.
The first stock market, wow.
Their government even issued perpetual annuities, which were seen as very safe, long-term investments.
And what were the key ingredients for their success? Was it institutions again?
Again, yes, a combination. We see good state involvement, such as the establishment of powerful monopoly trading companies like the VOC, the Dutch East India Company,
The famous VOC.
and collaborative funding for crucial infrastructure projects like land drainage, but also, importantly, good institutions. Policies that favored merchants, a relatively high degree of freedom for the exchange of ideas and religious beliefs, and a freer peasantry compared to many other parts of Europe.
So a more merchant-friendly environment overall.
You could say that. Plus, they had some geographical advantages, effectively harnessing wind power, a bit of a buffer from France, and even the silting of the port of Bruges and the impact of the Spanish Wars on Antwerp inadvertently benefited Amsterdam.
A confluence of factors, then.
Exactly. And this leads us to the second critical juncture, the growing importance of Atlantic trade. Acemoglu and his colleagues argued in a 2005 study that Atlantic trade was a major driver of growth in northwestern Europe.
Okay, so the Atlantic becomes key.
Their research indicates that those involved in Atlantic trade were more urbanized, enjoyed higher average incomes, and the sheer volume of trade across the Atlantic became significantly larger than that in the Mediterranean, as these graphs illustrating urbanization rates and trade volume demonstrate.
So while the Mediterranean had been crucial, the Atlantic really unlocked a new scale of economic opportunity.
A whole different scale.
But it's important to remember, as you keep saying, that even with this potential, those good institutions were still vital for translating that opportunity into lasting success.
Absolutely sensible.
This helps explain why Italy, Portugal, and Spain, despite their earlier advantages in exploration and trade, eventually fell behind.
Exactly. The Dutch and the English, arguably, had less absolute forms of government and were perhaps more tolerant towards merchants and diverse religious groups. Which brings us to phase 3. Britain and the emergence of modern economic growth, starting around 1700.
Right, Britain steps up.
The GDP per capita graph clearly shows England's steady and then accelerating climb during this period.
Britain really built a vast global trade empire, often at the expense of its competitors. This provided them with access to raw materials and ready markets for their manufactured goods.
Crucial inputs and outputs.
We also see the agricultural revolution gaining momentum with innovations like enclosure of land, new crop rotations, and selective animal breeding.
Feeding the growing population and freeing up labor.
And there was significant structural change underway, a move away from primarily agriculture towards early manufacturing, what's sometimes called proto-industry, and then into full industrialization.
A fundamental shift in the economy structure.
And again, the significance of good institutions cannot be overstated, can it?
It really can't. Secure property rights, limitations on the power of the monarchy after the Glorious Revolution of 1688,
A major political shift.
and the establishment of influential scientific societies like the Royal Society in 1662 all fostered innovation and economic activity. They also had a growing pool of skilled people, a willingness to apply technical and scientific knowledge to practical problems.
Human capital.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. And the development of robust credit markets, a prime example being the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, as shown in this image.
The Bank of England, okay.
The early adoption of the factory system and steam-powered technology led to sustained growth in what economists call total factor productivity, which is essentially a measure of how efficiently all inputs, labor, capital, technology, are being used to generate output.
So getting more output for the same input, basically. Efficiency gains.
Precisely. Sustained efficiency gains.
So Britain seems to have assembled all the necessary pieces for sustained economic growth. But it's interesting to consider that the Netherlands was also a very strong contender, right? Even being ahead in some respects during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, as this relative GDP per capita graph comparing Britain and the Netherlands illustrates.
They were definitely neck and neck for a while.
So why did Britain and not the Netherlands achieve true modern economic growth? That's our third critical juncture.
That's the key question, and it's complex. While the Netherlands experienced significant economic expansion, it didn't fully meet all the criteria that economist Simon Kuznets defined as characteristics of modern economic growth.
Okay, what were those criteria?
Things like sustained growth in both population and GDP per capita, significant shifts in the structure of the economy, like moving from agriculture to industry, increasing urbanization and secularization, rapid transport and communication, a widening economic gap globally between richer and poorer nations, and crucially, high and sustained growth and efficiency, that total factor productivity we mentioned.
Right, that sustained TFP growth.
Britain achieved this sustained increase in efficiency, often described as Schumpeterian growth driven by continuous innovation.
Schumpeterian. So, creative destruction, new technologies replacing old ones.
Kind of, yes. Whereas the Netherlands' growth was perhaps more of a Smithian growth, driven primarily by trade and speculation, essentially making the existing system work better rather than fundamentally transforming it through new technologies.
Okay, so improving the existing system versus inventing a new one.
That's a good way to think about it. Think of Smithian growth as expanding the existing pie through more trade, and Schumpeterian growth as inventing a whole new, bigger kind of pie through innovation.
It's interesting that historians Vase and Vandervood proposed a slightly different definition of modern growth, focusing on things like the integration of markets, agricultural productivity, the capacity of the state, and technological innovation.
Yes, and you could argue that the Netherlands met some of those criteria quite well. But that sustained transformative innovation seems to have been the crucial difference maker for Britain in the long run.
That technological edge.
It seems so.
Yeah.
So, can we draw any broader conclusions from this European miracle? Broadberry's point about how a society's economic structure and institutions shaped its response to those critical junctures, like the Black Death and the opening of new trade routes, seems really central.
Yeah, how societies react to shocks.
Exactly. For some, these were major setbacks. For others, they ultimately presented opportunities for long-term advancement. The overall story suggests that Europe, over the course of the second millennium, developed institutions that were better suited for sustained long-run growth compared to many other parts of the world. Although it's important to remember that other regions had periods of strong institutional development earlier. Tolerance, a willingness to accept different ideas and people, likely played a significant role in fostering innovation and trade as well.
And Europe certainly capitalized on the expanding opportunities in global trade, first in the Mediterranean and then on a much larger scale in the Atlantic.
They definitely seized those opportunities.
They also seem to benefit from capitalizing on commercial limitations or shifts in focus elsewhere, as we saw with China's move inward in the 15th century.
Absolutely. Timing and circumstance played a part, alongside internal developments. Ultimately, it appears that the interplay between thriving trade and the development of those good institutions was the real engine of sustained economic growth.
Trade and institutions working together.
Pre-modern European success was largely built on this Smithian growth driven by trade, but Britain was the first to truly achieve that self-sustaining modern economic growth fueled by ongoing innovation. It's also important to keep in mind, as Professor Elliott's lecture notes highlight, that this whole idea of the European miracle and the nature of pre-modern growth is still actively debated among historians.
Right, it's not a settled story.
Not entirely. With different perspectives from scholars like Gregory Clark, Ken Pomeranz, Robert Allen, and the early modernists, such as Madison and Broadberry themselves, they have different interpretations of things like real wages and overall income levels in various parts of the world during these periods, underscoring that this is a continuous area of scholarly inquiry.
So the European miracle wasn't a sudden event, but a long and complex process of evolving economic systems shaped by the opportunities of trade, the gradual development of vital institutions, and how different societies navigated those major turning points in history.
A very long runway, you could say.
It really makes you think, considering these historical foundations, what aspects of these past miracles might offer insights into economic development and the shifts in global power we're witnessing today? What might be considered our modern critical junctures, and how might different societal structures respond to them? Definitely a lot to ponder as you continue your own deep dive into this fascinating interaction between institutions, trade, and technological change.